Welcome back to Operator Syndrome. We are talking about rules of engagement today. This is a topic that we've had some listeners write in and ask us to discuss. I think that in the past 20 plus years of the global war on terror, um, I mean, it's always been a consideration, but I think, in mass media, in the news, and in published works, it's a common topic that came up. We have our own experiences with rules of engagement and how it affected us. So, figure we talk about that today. And we are in the fantastic position of having a learned professor who can who can discuss the historical aspects of rules of engagement. And so, Steve, we'll turn it over to you, and you can get us introduced to the topic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there have been some interest, especially among some of my friends and listeners who come from they're civilians. They've never been in the military, and it does at first just sound like a weird thing, rules of engagement or law of war, because I mean when you're trying to kill people, it seems like well what's all this being nice, and it's not really being nice. There's actually logic behind it, that what we wanted to get into. But yeah, there are rules, and there's it goes way back in history. I teach classics at University of Louisville, so Greek and Roman classics. And one of the going back to into the 700s BC, when at the time when Homer was writing, and another classical author, Hesiod, were writing. They were writing in the 8th century BC. Of course, Homer is famous for the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two classic epic poems. They're actually poems, uh, discussing the Trojan War. Well, the Iliad deals with the Trojan War. The Odyssey's Odysseus trying to make it home from the Trojan War. Um, and there's a character who's the most famous warrior in Greek anything was Achilles, the legendary hero. His mother was a sea goddess. His father was a hero. Heroes usually, not always, but usually in Greek myth and classics, the heroes are what we call demigods. One of their parents is a god, an immortal god, and the other parent is a mortal. So Achilles was very tough, but they can be killed. Yeah, so he was the greatest Greek warrior ever. And there's an account by Homer in the Iliad that after Achilles defeats Hector, who is the hero kind of prince king of Troy, also a very tough fighter, but Achilles kills him, and then afterwards ties Hector's body to his chariot and drags the corpse around the walls of Troy like several times. Like, and you could only imagine that his body would be mangled, and it would be pretty unpleasant. Well, this was outrageous, not to the Trojans for sure, just their king. Seeing him be mutilated like this, but also to the Greeks. I mean, they thought he's gone over the line, and Achilles was always known for going over the line. He had a attitude problem. He had anger issues, we would say today, and he uh, he was just a character. But and he offended the gods. The god Apollo was pissed off at him for doing this. You just didn't do that. That's not what you do with a dead body. And so I'm just bringing this point out just to say this goes back as probably as far as long as we've been fighting one another, or at least from the time when we became quote unquote civilized and we started realizing humanitarian values were of import. So all through history, there have been these agreements basically by different, what you would call, I mean, nations more of a modern term, but kingdom, uh, place, a political structure, a group of people or an ethnic group of people, to where we decided, hey, some things are allowable and some things aren't. So it's ancient. It goes way back. I thought to bring it to springboard about 3,000 years to today. what there's two groups of concepts, and they overlap. They're related. One is called rules of engagement, which means what at what particular times can a soldier fire on an enemy. And then there's the law of war. So I thought I would get into both of these. I had this huge document from it's a NATO document, which is like 50 pages on standing rules of engagement. Standing rules of engagement are rules that always apply at war or not at war. So a soldier has the right to defend themselves, not unlike a homeowner has the right to defend their home and their family against an intruder. If that, if that meant even using deadly force, that could be seen as justified. So the standing rules of engagement usually go something like this: the soldier has the right to defend themselves, and they are able to return fire if fired upon, things like that. But then we also have specific rules of engagement. So I thought what I'd do is read. This is one source. This is a publication, an Army publication called Counterinsurgency. It's an FM, a field manual, and there's gazillions of these field manuals for everything under the sun. This is Field Manual 3-24, and it was written by a pretty well-known guy by the name of Lieutenant General David Petraeus, he was in charge of Afghanistan forces for early 2000s for I can't remember exactly the dates, but very accomplished special forces officer. And so he wrote this manual, and I thought it had the best overview in it of rules of engagement that I'd heard. And I'm not going to get into the weeds of this. I just thought I'd read this one paragraph that's how Petraeus defines the rules of engagement. It says rules of engagement, ROEs. So if we say ROEs, that's what we're talking about, are directives issued by competent military authority that delineate the circumstances and limitations under which United States forces will initiate and or continue combat engagement with other forces encountered. Often these directives are specific to the operation. If there are no operation-specific ROEs, U.S. forces apply standing ROEs, or rules of engagement. When working with a multinational force, commanders must coordinate the ROE thoroughly. So there you have it. It's specific. Like if we were briefed on missions where we were going out and we got briefed by a legal representative from the military. In the Navy, we call them JAG officers, and they would say, okay, here is exactly what you're to target, and you may return fire, fired upon, blah, blah, blah. And they go through like specific objectives, like we were planning a big explosive attack on a particular target. So anyway, so you got the operation specific and then the standing rules that are kind of always in effect. Because this happened. By the way, a lot of this got revised after the I think it was 83 bombing of the barracks in Beirut, the Marine barracks. A bunch of people got killed, like 200. I think it might have been the largest mass casualty in U.S. history. It was up there. Mm-hmm. There was like hundreds, at least casualties. I can't remember how many got killed, but it was serious business. And so that was a murky area because we were there. We were stationed there. We had Marines stationed there. And bad guys, terrorists, members of Hamas were taking pot shots at Marines. They were just popping over these walls and ripping off, some AK rounds. Well, that's annoying, but the Marines were told to, just, take cover, don't return fire. It was very political. It was very political. So they didn't want to kick off a big, massive set of attacks. But after that bombing, things were like, wait a second, we need to take this a little more serious because anyhow. And so that led to some changes. On the other hand, the law of war is, I'll read the definition of this because I thought this was interesting. I knew this, but I I'd never seen it laid out as kind of systematically as this. So the law of war as opposed to ROE. Coin, that's a capital COIN, is an abbreviation for counterinsurgency. Coin and international armed conflicts often overlap. Coin may take place before, after, or simultaneously with a war occurring between nations. U.S. forces obey the law of war. The law of war is a body of international treaties and customs recognized by the United States as binding. It regulates the conduct of hostilities and protects non-combatants. So it's kind of twofold there. The main law of war protections come from the Hague and Geneva Conventions. They apply at the tactical and operational levels and are summarized in 10 rules. These are the 10. Soldiers and Marines fight only enemy combatants. Soldiers and Marines do not harm enemies who surrender. They disarm them and turn them over to their superiors. Soldiers and Marines do not kill or torture enemy prisoners of war. Soldiers and Marines collect and care for the wounded, whether friend or foe. Soldiers and Marines do not attack medical personnel, facilities, or equipment. Soldiers and Marines do not destroy no more than the mission requires. And soldiers and Marines treat all civilians humanely. Soldiers and Marines do not steal. They respect private property and possessions. Soldiers and Marines do their best to prevent violations of the law of war. And last, soldiers and Marines report all violations of the law of war to their superiors. So that's the big flyover of ROEs and the law of war, and they all, like I say, govern our actions in using deadly force, basically.
I mean, a question popped into my head. I hadn't thought about this before, and we hadn't discussed it before, so I'm a little bit putting you on the spot here with this question. But you're the exact right person. Is it safe to assume that religion, that perhaps religion has played a part in the formation of these norms, this idea that combat is not just a free for all, like there are some standards there.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
and to take it even one step further after that, of the, we'll say the big three, or any religions that you've studied, are you aware of any of those that don't have those kind of provisions, that say, hey, do whatever you want? Because that became a thing and a common talking point, especially in the last 20 years and what we were doing. But I'll send it to you.
Yeah. No, that's a really good. Yeah. First of all, absolutely, there's a connection with religious traditions. In Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the three Abrahamic faiths, we call them, which are much closer together than you might think. Really, our holy books kind of go back in one big line. One of the earliest books in the Bible is in the Old Testament, what we call the Hebrew Scriptures. It's Jewish Bible. Christians call it the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament. But the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 18 and following, set out rules of war for the Israelites. Things like, if you conquer an area, don't chop down the fruit trees. Let the fruit trees live, because they take a long time to grow, and it's going to be giving life, so yeah, all kinds of stuff like that. And then even in the New Testament, there's a case where a centurion, which is a Roman a commander of 100 men, a century is 100, and a centurion, it was like Russell Crowe was a centurion in that movie. What was the name of it?
Gladiator.
Gladiator. Yeah, real hard one. There's a centurion came up to John the Baptist, who's the forerunner to Jesus, a prophet, and said, they were all asking ethical questions about following the rule of God, and the soldier said, what should I do as a soldier? How should I conduct myself? And John the Baptist said in return, and this is in Luke, I believe, chapter 4, it says, Um, be content with your wages and don't use force against anybody. Don't use your military might to take things from civilians, interestingly enough. So right there, you have two connections, and there are many more from the scriptures. Now, the big influence in Christianity came under Saint Augustine or Augustine, depending on your level of sophistication. And Saint Augustine, who obviously had a very, very huge impact on Western Christianity, uh, wrote a treatise on just war. He basically invented the term just war. So if you read military books on military ethics, it'll start with Augustine saying, okay, just war is this. Things like um, things like use proportionate means to and see that's reflected in what I just read. Only use enough force, but not excessive force. Um, you know, and there's a number. I don't want to get into a whole thing on Augustinian just war ethics, but yeah. So there's another connection, and he was a church father who was heavily influential in both the Catholic and later Protestant churches. So definitely, as far as other world religions, I know I even talk about this. They all do have a grounding in like humanity and humane treatment of other human beings. I'll just mention one because it's a very broad, lot of different angles. But in Hinduism, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the Mahabharata, which is a big epic poem, there's a situation where this prince Arjuna is getting ready to go into battle, and he just starts crying because he realizes his countrymen are going to fight for him, and he realizes it's going to be a lot of bloodshed. And the god Krishna comes and consoles him and said, "Well, you're a warrior, you're a Kshatriya caste. You've got to do this. It's ugly, but this happens." And he kind of lays out, that discussion of how, yeah, this is going to suck. Human lives are going to be lost, but it gets into the ethics of it, and it goes into all kinds of different directions. But another example, I think it's so weighty. The samurais had all kinds of laws in Japan about respecting and bowing. I mean, like almost politely, all right, we're going to hack each other to death, but I respect you as a warrior. And so there is this ebb and flow of and religious implications.
On the and I just want to stress again, I didn't prep Steve for that answer, so he's the real deal, man.
uh,
That was crazy. Good,
no,
crazy, good. On the flip side of that, I think um, a very modern case that's the complete opposite would be ISIS, right? So
yeah,
ISIS seemed to be, and
yeah,
I'm not any kind of expert on what their goals were, but on the face of it, and what people reported out was that they were using their religion, trying
mm-hmm.
to establish an Islamic caliphate, and they were just doing some really horrific, brutal things, not just to fighters they were fighting, but just to innocent folks. And I
Yeah,
believe they were justifying it using their religion. Uh,
yeah,
uh, Anyone with half a brain knows that you can take even the Bible, the
yeah,
Christian
yeah,
Bible, any religion, anything, and you can misinterpret, malinterpret, whatever you want to call it, and justify horrific shit. So is it can we confirm that to some extent that what
yeah.
ISIS was doing was really just a bastardization of their own religion?
Yeah, and any holy book you can do that. This is
Yeah.
a book, one of my most influential theologians who I actually been able to interview, John D. Caputo. He's at Villanova and Syracuse. He wrote about this interpretation thing. I just found this a hilarious quote. It's a Q&A, and the question to Dr. Caputo was, people can make the scriptures say almost anything they want. And his reply is, well, that's because the scriptures say almost anything you want. So yeah, whether it's a cult in Christianity or some fringe group or ISIS, yeah, you can bend it. You can bend it and we see that all the time. I mean, I don't, yeah, it's frustrating to me. And another interesting thing is, and I say this after studying at the graduate level and reading Greek and Hebrew and New Testament, um, I could make a really strong case that Jesus, the historical Jesus of Nazareth, was definitely a pacifist. I could make a rock solid case. Now, that's not to say, well, if you're a Christian and you're a military, you're not a real Christian. I'm not anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying, from everything I've seen, and that doesn't even get into imperatives for what Christians ought to do. I'm just saying
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was definitely a pacifist. Whether he wanted his disciples to all be that way, that's a whole nother discussion. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm not I don't have a stake in this case either way, but he definitely, it looks like, was he
Mm-hmm.
that the turn the other cheek. And Peter draws his sword to defend Jesus when he was being arrested at the time of his crucifixion. He said, put your sword in its place. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And then he goes on to say, my followers don't fight. We turn the other cheek. So yeah, I mean, and some groups like the Amish, the Mennonites, they are what we call conscientious objectors. They by theology. One of the things I had to do as a chaplain, if somebody, this was a really interesting case study. We had all these ethical situations that we had to respond to in chaplain basic school, and one was, okay, tell us how you're going to counsel somebody if they say, like, they want out of the military, they've had enough, and they want to get out of their contract, and they're a pacifist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we take it seriously, and they have a chaplain interview the commanding officer, and the chaplain interview that individual and decide together whether to submit the paperwork to process them out, if in fact they really do. And it's really funny because the chaplain has a lot of power. It's like what the chaplain says pretty much flies because they know religious law, they know theology.
Mm-hmm.
And so if some guy who's raised Baptist, and let's say he's been to sniper school, the Marine walks in and says, "Yeah, had a change of heart. I'm going to be a pacifist." There's nothing. I mean, that's hypothetical that I'm just throwing out in a rather extreme form, but
Sure. Sure.
there's nothing like interviewing that person. There's nothing historically, theologically that would lead me to believe that that person was actually a conscientious objector. It would
Mm-hmm.
be, this person probably just wants out of the military and is trying to get an honorable discharge through claiming to be a pacifist when their whole trajectory of their life has not shown that to be weighty on them. But it
Mm-hmm.
could be the case that somebody really does have some awakening and converts to Buddhism, and which a lot of the Buddhist sects are uh, pacifistic. So could be. I'm not saying one way or the other, but if somebody's Amish, they're exempt even from the draft. If we were to have a draft, we don't have a draft, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't have to register with whatever it's called, selective
Selective service.
service,
Yeah.
yeah, 18 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a case where all you got to do is show you're Amish, and Sila, you don't have to go.
And there are, I keep saying this, but this isn't necessarily the road we were trying to go down, but let's just keep
Yeah,
going with it. The Let's take Christianity.
yeah,
And for Christianity, I remember the History Channel back in the old days before it was all just, you know,
yeah.
before it was all just swamp guys and pawn stars, this or
Mm.
whatever it is. Back
Aliens,
when they used to have like actual historical
right?
content, no shade History Channel. But
Yeah.
I remember they did a series. I don't remember that much of it, but they did a series where they were discussing how the Bible could be in its many interpretations. Like some could look at it as a manual for warfare, like
Mm-hmm.
in
Oh
some
yeah.
ways, like in some ways that it was like an archive or something
Mm-hmm.
of sort of, tactics, and that sort of stuff, as well as like an actual history of things that have
Uh-huh.
come by. And I think that one's more obvious. But going tying back to religion's allowance for combat.
Yeah.
And we can talk Christianity specifically. And this is a question that any probably any type of religious person may come to a chaplain and ask and say,
Yeah.
hey chaps, I'm an infantry marine, I'm a
Yeah.
mortarman, I'm an army ranger, I'm a this, I'm a that.
Mhm.
Like, am I going to hell
Right.
because I might have to kill someone one day,
Right.
or I did have to kill
Yeah.
someone.
Yeah.
What is and tying it back, let's tie it back to rules of engagement. let's
Yeah.
say let's say they're operating within the rules of engagement. It's still a tough call to make. um what does Christianity, what do any other religions say
Yeah.
about the professional, just use the term soldier, the
Yeah.
professional soldier who is who is in the position where they're taking another life?
Yeah. I had that a couple times. I had a couple soldier sailors come to me and with that very question. It's funny when I was in boot camp, the chaplain came to talk to us, and I asked that same question when I was in boot camp.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, just things are funny how they come full circle. But yeah, I approached it a couple different ways. Um, I would always cite the one I said about the John the Baptist talking to the centurion who clearly was a convert to Christ. Um, he said he said he didn't say desert the military and become a pacifist. He just said stay within the lanes of what's reasonable for a soldier. Don't use your force in an abusive way and be happy with your pay. That was pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
That brings a lot of comfort to people if they're really serious about their faith because it's right there in the scriptures. The other thing I would tell them is, well, you've got I would always say, don't I would caution you. This is my opinion, of course, and can't tell you what to do, obviously, but I would caution anybody to violate their conscience. So I think the conscience is a very sacred thing. It's like we have nerves in our fingers so we don't burn ourselves, but we have a conscience that is telling us things that we need to listen to. Um, and I saw guys, and you probably maybe have seen some guys. We've read about some guys that I think their conscience was just seared to where they didn't have it anymore, and that's bad. That when you get to
Mm-hmm.
that point, you don't feel anything.
Mm-hmm.
um, I mean, we have emotions for a reason, and they're usually good reasons for them. So I would tell soldier sailors, don't do anything that violated your conscience. Come to me as a chaplain, and I'll take it to the CO. We can maybe work to reassign you if it's a certain thing you're doing that is really causing you strife and to be upset. And then the last thing I would tell them is simply this: look, if you believe in Christianity, as I do, then even if you do something that your superiors above you are telling you to do, and it's not in line with the law of God, God will forgive you. That's the whole point of Christianity is forgiveness. And Jesus tells the murderer next to him on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. Dude had murdered somebody. So yeah, and the Old Testament is a pretty violent book. Whatever you want to think about it. I mean, God says, "Go in there and wipe these people out." Basically,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds pretty hardcore. But the,
Right.
the New Testament is a little better, but the Book of Revelation is very violent. It's going all this bloodbath and Armageddon, and I mean, it's like there's a lot of fighting going on in the Bible. So, but I always thought it was interesting that in the Hebrew, if you read the Ten Commandments in Hebrew, the word for do not kill is specific. It's a word called ratzak in Hebrew, which means don't murder, like malice aforethought, which we would argue is the difference between manslaughter, self-defense, and murder one if you
Mm-hmm.
go to a court of law. Um, there are other words for kill that are more generic, but that word for murder was chosen in the Ten Commandments. So I would say that's kind of interesting that it lends one to think that maybe not all forms of killing are necessarily wrong in the eyes of God. For example, self-defense. So,
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, well, yeah, because I wonder, and I try to make that, and I'm trying to think through that distinction of professional soldier, because we talked about before how an ambush,
yeah,
a typical classic ambush,
yeah,
that you trained and I trained. I actually was never in a position to actually do an actual ambush. Um, to lay in an ambush. I don't know if you were you ever set up
no,
to do it? No.
not
Um,
real world. No.
yeah, I think in Vietnam that's
Yeah,
almost all they that's nearly
yeah, they
almost
did it
all they
all the
did.
time,
That's
and
all
they
they
were
did.
pretty nasty ambushes. Like Mike
Yeah.
Bailey taught when he taught ambushes, he taught okay, and we're not doing huge. We're doing patrols that are
Hmm.
kind of proportionate to our firepower.
Hmm.
He said all he taught us how to set up claymores in the kill zone to where once that one first person in the patrol was by the last first claymore and you clacked them off, and he said a lot of times you didn't even have to shoot your weapon. The claymores, I'm like, whoa.
I bet. Yeah.
Yeah, for those who don't maybe not know, a claymore mine is a mine about this big. It has little stands, you put it in the ground, and it has like 100 ball bearings, stainless steel ball bearings, and C4 explosive that just blasts these ball bearings at ungodly speeds, and obviously rip through whatever. Definitely an offensive weapon, but anyhow, they used them a lot in Vietnam. Um,
Yeah, so in the case of an ambush, it's, and it was, again, we said this before, but in any other context, it's almost like premeditated murder. It's the
yeah,
idea is it's not like set up an ambush and then jump out and say, surprise, put your weapons down.
right.
It is
No,
you're initiating death
yeah,
as a consequence of them, just whoever it might be. You don't know. You
I
you
know.
only have identified them as enemy, and then they wrong place, wrong time for them, right?
And you're not giving them any chance to surrender or fight back.
Right.
It's just over. It's
But
over.
but ambush is like that goes all the way back to, swords and pikes, and
Yeah,
it take different forms, different
right.
variations, but it's a tried and true combat tactic, and in the
Absolutely.
execution of, a war, battles, wars. It's one of the tools at your disposal. So when I think back to like the context of how religions treated
Mhm.
treated professional soldiers versus
Right.
like murderers, like,
Right.
and it seems like that's kind of what you're saying, is it comes down to like the intent. um there are some people who are interested in causing harm and torture and pain and suffering on people, and there's a murder professional soldier. It's and you listed out the rules, tying it all the way
Yeah.
back to the beginning. It's like you're using the only only the amount of force required in death, I guess.
Yeah.
Death
Yeah.
required to accomplish what it is you need to accomplish.
Right.
um and so, yeah, it seems like it goes back to that intent, like what's in your heart. That's
That's
what I
right.
always thought, because I don't ever remember reading any chapters in the Bible about any battle that you may have heard of where then they're like, oh yeah, and by the way, all those soldiers are damned. Like they're
Yeah.
they're
Right.
fucked. They're fucked
Yeah.
because they
Yeah.
they killed the other guys. It didn't, I don't think, for me as just like a layperson,
Yeah.
it never came across like that.
Yeah.
And um and and professional warfare, we'll call it, I don't know what else, organized warfare,
Yeah.
um in any religion, it seemed like it was just such a common thing
Oh
back
yeah.
in those days.
Yeah. For sure. Throughout history. I mean, it's kind of the human condition is we we fight
Hmm. Yeah.
and we defend our group, whatever you
Hmm.
want to call that group, our tribe. Um, but yeah, there, I was reading an interesting thing talking about ambush and premeditated aspects. It's called the Killing of Bin Laden, of Osama bin Laden, by Seymour Hersh. It's Seymour Hersh is a Pulitzer winning journalist, and it's a short book, but it's a competing narrative as to what we were told by our government of as to the killing. Now he said, yeah, we killed him, we got him in Abbottabad in the compound. He didn't have any conspiracy theories about that, but he gets into what we knew and how we worked with the Pakistanis. And I haven't made up my mind. I don't know if I will make up my mind. There's so much I don't know, but it's an interesting book, and he's a serious journalist. So I'm reading it right now. And one of the assertions he makes is that some of the SEALs, I have no idea about this, some of the SEALs were kind of in a quandary about shooting bin Laden, because the the narrative our government gave us was he was grabbing for a gun, and there's one of his wives was trying to form a human shield, and we capped him. And Hersh says through documents and interviews he's had with people in the know, and I'm not judging one way or the other, that bin Laden was like really sick. I mean, could barely, he was an invalid basically, and never picked up a gun, and they just went in and murdered him basically. So, and some of the SEALs had a dilemma with that, because like he didn't grab a gun. He wasn't even going to try to put up a fight. He was so sick, and they just boom. So
Yeah,
that was an issue, you know.
I,
Interesting.
and we're running out of time here,
Yeah.
but and that seems to go into more gray area.
Right. Yeah,
We'll have
definitely.
to pick this back up. Actually, we'll carry on with this, and we got a couple case studies that we wanted to
Yeah.
talk through. So we'll do that in the next episode. But maybe we also open that up talking about um, just how, in more of a gray area, there's like the risk to you in the moment, and then there's the risk of just a dangerous person or
Yeah.
even like animals, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to put down wolves to
Right.
to protect the herd. So
Right.
we'll do that in the next episode. Thanks for listening. We appreciate it. Uh, See you guys next time.